Part 2, fashioning social norms in Jeux-partis. Medieval discourse is never more clearly laid out in song than in the body of debate songs known as Jeux-partis. The written record of these quote-unquote divided games implies a collaborative compositional process where a poet-composer would pose an either-or question in song, writing a single stanza which would set a melody, poetic meter, and rhyme scheme for the rest of the piece. A second trouvère would choose one of the arguments and write a response defending their choice. Then the question asker would make a counter-argument, and there'd be a back and forth over the next 4 or so stanzas. At the end, there are often 1 or 2 shortened stanzas called envoys, which appeal to judges to decide who won the argument. The format of these pieces implies they were part of social entertainment. One can imagine lively conversations and discussions ensuing after their performance, whether in noble courts or in bourgeois artistic societies known as puits. Jeux-partis most often treat topics related to social norms for behavior in love scenarios. Then, as now, these are deeply embedded with gendered expectations. The playful discussion of these topics suggests that gender roles were less rigid than one might think. It seems that the authors, performers, and audiences of these gamified dialogues use them not only for entertainment, but to fashion their society and educate one another about how to behave within it. And as an aside, I do want to say that if I had had the time and energy, it would have been better for me to put some of these in a singable English translation, because then you could really appreciate the full humor of the pieces. But that might be a good project for me down the line. The first song in this set is a pretty standard Jeux-partis, featuring an either-or question debated over 6 stanzas with 2 envoys. In this debate, the trouvère Grivillère argues that great intelligence is more valuable in a woman than exceptional beauty. In his envoy, he appeals to a judge named Demoiselle Oued, testifying to women's participation in conversation about social norms through this pastime. This also gives us an example of a man appealing to a feminine audience who might look favorably on him based on his choice of arguments. I will be taking up Jean Bretel's argument that beauty is more important, in opposition to Susanna, who will sing Grivillère. As a 21st century feminist, I tend to agree with Grivillère in this instance, despite the fact that he has a bunch of little misogynies in his poetry. Bearing in mind that the author who posed the question was required to argue the side not chosen by their opponent, I hope to demonstrate the possibility of playing against the text to apply a satirical or sarcastic affect to an argument I disagree with. I will attempt to take my delivery too far, exaggerating my movements and facial expressions to make the argument seem more ridiculous. Now, in the past few years, the efforts of Brian Dolce and others have found more female trouvères than scholars have traditionally thought, who were participating in puits not only by judging Jeux-partis like Demoiselle Oued, but by writing them. Only a very few of these Jeux-partis attributed to named women made their way to us in the trouvère manuscripts, but the ones we do have are a fascinating look into how medieval women might assert themselves within a popular tradition of social entertainment. Susanna and I will sing one of these, which is attributed to ladies named Margot and Marway. And the question is whether it is acceptable for a woman to confess her love to a man before he confesses to her. Though we must acknowledge the constraints of this either-or question, this song demonstrates that medieval women's individual opinions varied, just as they do today. Marway, for example, favors being outspoken, though she acknowledges that it might be a bit of a stretch in her culture by associating or equating speaking up to madness. Marway also holds a more conservative view of prostitution, more accepted view of prostitution as well, despite her other more liberal perspectives. Margot aligns with more stereotypical tropes and social norms where women might have been less empowered to assert themselves, citing a woman's inherent worth, which is a buzzword in Trouvère repertoire, as a reason to stay silent in a state of noble pining. If all sorts of people in the medieval world, including women, were having conversations like these, it is in the spirit of medieval musicking for modern performers to continue the conversation by adding our own perspectives to the debate. As Trouvère songs were performed, reperformed, and transcribed, they were often altered for other performers. In the form Tyler Duncan and I will sing tonight, the Jeux-partis Dites dames le cœur s'acquittait mieux is a dialogue between an unnamed lady and an unnamed lord. But versions of this poem appear in 4 other manuscripts and name different participants, all of whom are male. Das Quenby et al. Include this Jeux-partis in Songs of the Women Trouvères, pointing out that, quote, this unstable attribution highlights the ease with which a given discourse can be appropriated by a voice of a different gender, end quote. This is important to note, regardless of whether the unnamed lady was one of the original poets, because authorship and performance were intertwined in the medieval period. The fact that this Jeux-partis was written down multiple times with different names attests to the popularity of these songs and the longevity of the ideas within them. And that one manuscript assigns one of these arguments to a feminine voice lends legitimacy to the idea that it might have been performed by a woman at some point. Perhaps she chose which argument to take as she and her debate partner planned their own performance of this text. Now, the argument the feminine voice takes up might surprise a modern listener, because the dilemma is whether it's better to be a young lover who forsakes love in old age, or a man who finds love late in life, but then loves faithfully until death. The lady argues the former case, which turns out to be the more sexualized, and she is the first person to bring the argument around to sexuality, making jabs at her debate partner for being frail and tired in old age, saying, you know full well that you will get back pain, which keeps old men from laboring as long. Beyond the age of 40, one only declines. One is then hardly suited to partake in pleasure. The masculine voice then responds to these euphemisms with his own erotic simile about cows and bulls. Now, feminine characters in medieval fiction tend to use more sexual language than their masculine counterparts, in contrast to a lot of modern stories, which often paint women as sexually repressed and men as insatiable. The persona of the lady is thus potentially adopting a masculine perspective from one of the male participants in another manuscript, but in a way that neatly fits within the paradigm of her time. Thus, there's always the chance the lord and lady were merely fictionalized choices by the person who transcribed this version of the song. Regardless, the speaking subject's gender flexibility in this Jeux-partis allows us to assume that, at least in certain settings, this kind of entertaining and somewhat lewd debate was acceptable between a lord and lady of similar rank. The gender presentation of the singers matters here in this way, too. Having a younger feminine voice and an older masculine one performing this song highlights the poem's humor in a way that 2 similar voices might not.